Well, good evening. I think we'll get started, and thank you all for braving the weather and coming out on this soggy November Monday evening. It's great to see you here. My name is Chris Kiesling. I'm the Elmer L. Andersen Director of Archives and Special Collections here in the University of Minnesota Libraries. And it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the University Libraries to this screening of the documentary Tribal Justice. This screening is part of the programming around our exhibit, Such a Big Dream, Edward S. Curtis at 150, which celebrates his 150th birthday and showcases his monumental work, The North American Indian. And there will be time after the screening this evening for you to take a look at the exhibit if you're so inclined. But my task today is to introduce Ann Makepeace, who will say a few words about tribal justice before we start the film. Ann Makepeace is an internationally acclaimed writer, producer, and director of award-winning films. Her newest film, Tribal Justice, won awards at several film festivals, including Best Documentary Feature at the American Indian Film Festival and the Directing Award at Cinetopia. The scope of her work is quite remarkable, from architect I.M. Pei to Somali Bantu refugees, to Eleanor Roosevelt and the National Park Service, to war photographer Robert Capa, to theatrical features. So she's got quite a broad repertoire. Ann has served on the Sundance documentary jury and has been a resident at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center. Many prestigious foundations have funded her work, including the MacArthur Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Ann earned her BA in English, an MA in Education, and another MA in Film Production, all from Stanford University. I'm so pleased that we have her here this evening to introduce Tribal Justice.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. I actually have never been to Minneapolis before except in the airport, so it's really nice to get to know your city, and I had an introduction to some very cool things here earlier today. I won't talk long, just to say thank you so much for coming out tonight, and I hope you enjoy the film. It was a real honor to be entrusted with making this documentary and to have been given access to the courtrooms of these two amazing tribal judges in California. They're both women. They are the tribal judges, chief judges in their respective tribes, and their tribes are the largest tribes in California. So I won't say more. I'd much rather talk to you when you've seen it. And afterwards, as I imagine you know, we have a really exciting program with Justice Ann McKeig and Laurie Vilas, who's a peacemaking judge with I believe, the White Earth Nation. And so I hope you'll stay for that discussion after the film. Very special to be with those two, a little intimidating. All right, enjoy the film.
We have on, just immediately to my left here, Minnesota Supreme Court Associate Justice Ann McKeig, and on the far left, my far left, the Honorable Laurie Vilas, peacemaker for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. A descendant of the White Earth Nation, Justice McKeig is the first Native American to serve on the Minnesota Supreme Court. Prior to that appointment in 2016, she served on the Hennepin County Court as a Hennepin County Assistant Attorney, specializing in child protection, and as an Indian Child Welfare Act specialist. Laurie Vilas' work focuses on custody, visitation, and guardianship cases, as well as prisoner reentry with a goal of reducing recidivism. She serves on the advisory committee for the Indigenous Peacemaking Initiative. And please welcome Ann and Laurie.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Oh, well, that's right. Do we need this? Oh, okay. So it's a real honor to be on this panel with both of you. I'm really excited, and I'm sure the audience will want to hear more from you than from me. But I'm going to ask a couple of questions to start, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So I guess my first question is, how does what you just saw in the film relate to what you do in your court, what you're able to do in your courts, what you try to do in your courts, the values you try to bring to your courts. So would you like to start, or Laurie, would you like to start?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. In Mille Lacs Band Tribal Court, it's about custody, visitation, and guardianship. And peacemaking, when done there, it's done with traditional values. So I talk about those 7 teachings, and I bring those values up. Talk about them to be, show the respect, your love, your honesty, your truth, wisdom, humility, and courage. And when we talk that way to everyone, it seems like everyone just mellows out. And then we try to bridge the gap. So if we have families in disagreement, we can bring them closer together through the restorative justice piece and using values.
Well, I'm not a tribal court judge. I was a district court judge, and prior to that, I was a county attorney working in the child protection division, specializing in Indian child welfare. And I watched the film earlier today, and then again parts of it tonight. And it's I started in 1992 doing child protection work, and sadly, not a lot has changed. And one of the reasons that I wanted to try to get on the Supreme Court was because it gives me an opportunity to try to do things statewide, because you can only do so much in your individual capacities, and there's so much work to be done, because there's so much value, I think, in what you've seen here in the film, and yet we're not necessarily doing that yet in this state. And this film reminded me, when you become a district court judge, you have to go to the prisons. And I went to Oak Park Heights, and then when you get there, there's a board, and it has all of the individuals who are incarcerated there. And so when I went there, it was sad for me to see how many young men that I had removed as children who were now incarcerated. And there was one individual in particular that I just remembered him clear as day, and it really weighed on me. And so maybe 3 months ago, I looked to see where he was, and he was actually about to be released from Faribault prison. And so I called his old social worker, and I said, we're going to go see him. And, he said, what, have you lost your mind? And it's like, well, maybe, but we're going to go see him, because I just feel like we need to connect with him and see where his brain is at, and see if there's anything that we can do to help him be successful when he actually gets out. And it just was, I was really reminded by that again in watching this film. And, sadly, it was a great discussion with him. I met with him for an hour and 40 minutes, and it was a lot of what you saw here, really apologizing to him as a system and how we failed him and how it wasn't his fault, and that there were people who cared about him. And, I hadn't seen him in 20 some years, and he's 34 now. And he started to cry. And he said, I didn't know that I wasn't just a paycheck. He's like, and it's heartbreaking for me to hear that that's what he's been thinking. And he was released, and I met with him a couple times after that. And now, he's wanted. And sadly, it's not a surprise to me. But it reminds me that there's just so much work to be done.
Thank you. So even in your very high position, you are reaching out in a personal way to people who get caught up in the justice system, and I think that's really commendable for both of you. My next question is, it's related, how can the way that Abby and Claudette are able to mete out that kind of personal justice, how can that work in mainstream courts and state courts? What parts of it can work? What's not possible? How can we influence mainstream courts to, use more restorative methods, more humane methods that won't result in mass incarceration as they are now? In
Monoman County, I worked with juvenile offenders, and I was able to work within 3 counties through the state court. And what we did there was create a diversion program. And so we were able to work with the individual within the community to clear those criminal charges. And then we'd go back to the court and say, this is what we did, agreement. And this was agreement with people, members from the community. So everyone had a say in how we would resolve the issues.
Yeah, I don't think we have a choice. And when you think about it, it's no different. You know, my hometown's 106 people. You know, I grew up in Federal Dam up on Leech Lake Reservation, and when that becomes a place that's very familiar and it's comfortable, and it was a hard place to leave to come to the Twin Cities because the Twin Cities was just foreign to me. And it's that level of comfortableness, you know, when I was home on the res, even now, and there's no reason and that we can't recreate that in the court system. We just have to have a desire to do so, because I don't think it's just an Indian country. I think that that's what everyone wants. I mean, we're seeing people who are really at their lowest moments, and they just want some human compassion. And even sometimes when you're helping them make decisions that are painful, it may be that they can't care for their children for multiple reasons, but when they can be a part of the process and making those decisions, I just think it's better all the way around. And if we don't do this, what we're going to see is we're just going to keep incarcerating people. And even if you just look at it in a monetary level, which is not the way I would look at it, but I think if you just talk to people in the fiscal world, it's like, well, you're going to pay for it one way or another. You can certainly spend a lot less and invest in people early on and not be paying for it on the back end.
Thank you. Yeah, one thing that's been heartening to me is, you know, while making this film, I mean, I didn't start out to know much about tribal courts, is to have discovered that there are community courts, you know, non-tribal. There's one in Brooklyn that's a community court, and they actually model what they do on, to some extent, Navajo peacemakers. They have a peacemaking program, and on what Abby does. They looked at what Abby does in her court. So it is starting to trickle out into mainstream courts, I think. And the fact that the film has been in demand in law schools across the country means that young people who are going to go into the legal profession are being exposed, at least, to a different way of doing things. I wanted to ask Laurie, I think there probably are people here who don't really know how the peacemaking process goes, so maybe you could just lay that out a little bit for people.
It's about building, bringing people together. It's about resolving issues. The issues can be between a social worker, in family cases, it can be the social worker and the families. Maybe they don't understand why they have to complete a case plan. The case plan might include things that they're very uncomfortable with. And so if we resolve the issues of why, or explain it to them or put it out there, then they have a better chance at completing what's needed in court. Tribal court isn't so much different as state courts. The judges that I talk to in Mille Lacs Band say it's much harder to hold up the bench when you're a traditional person. Meaning when you live by those values, it's different. Because in the adversarial system, there's no love. In our communities, that's what it needs. It needs a lot of love. And we need to listen instead of telling people. And we need to listen to what their needs are, not the individual telling them what they need. So that's basically what peacemaking is about. It's about bringing people together in a good way. In tribal community, it's much easier because a lot of people say, I'm very cultural. I follow my values. So if we talk about those values, we know those values, we become those values.
Thank you.
Yeah, and actually Minnesota is has been doing, like, there's a wellness court up in Cass County that partners with the Leech Lake Reservation, and so that's been in place for quite some time, and actually was a national model that's been used across the country. So we know that we have the abilities to do it, and you're right, it can't be looking at the person and judging, and it's really about having a conversation and getting people comfortable enough so that they know that, we're not sitting up in that high spot in the courtroom. It's really like, well, how are you doing? And tell me what's not working, and becoming invested in those that come before the court. And that doesn't really take a whole lot more time than just running through the cases in perhaps the traditional manner. And for sure, in the juvenile court, that's, I think, an obligation that we have. And we have, statewide, we're trying to make a lot of these changes. In fact, there's a group of us going out to Michigan next week, actually, to look at what they're doing in their peacemaking courts and seeing what we can bring back to Minnesota, because, it just takes a strong desire. So I think that Minnesota is fully capable. It's just that we have to roll up our sleeves and get in with it.
Right. Yeah, there's a judge that I know he's not native, and it's a county court, but it's a peacemaking court in Ann Arbor. Maybe you know him, Tim Connors. Oh, you're going to see Tim. Okay, and he just arranged this 2 screenings actually at the at the Michigan Supreme Court just on Halloween night. So there's a lot of energy, I think, behind this movement towards a more restorative model of justice. I wanted to ask you both about the recent ruling in Texas that ruled that the Indian Child Welfare Act, which you saw a little bit about here and probably many of you know about, a federal judge just ruled it unconstitutional. So all the progress that's been made to reconnect children to their families, their tribes, and try to keep them in their extended families is endangered. So I'd love each of you to comment about that case and what that could mean.
Well, I have to be careful because I'm neutral. I have no opinion. But I will say, in the county attorney's office, when I worked as a county attorney, I don't think I would have stayed doing child protection work if it wasn't that I had the chance to work on Indian child welfare cases and work so closely with my community. I mean, I stayed in that division for 16 years, which is unusual. Most of the time they say, they think of that as a training ground, which is ridiculous because I think it's the most important place in our court system. But a lot of people start out there and then it's, hey, come do the big jury trials and, do all this much more sexy work. And we did a lot of really good work there, and part of that requires a desire to want to do right, to want to do well, and to acknowledge when we've made mistakes. And to see this opinion come down in 2018 is it's extremely troubling, and I suspect it will not stand. I hope. I could say so much more about that, but I just probably should not.
Thank you. Did you want to comment on that, Laurie?
No, I'm okay.
I guess it's TBD, right? To see what, because I'm sure it'll be appealed, right? So I would like to open it up to questions, and somebody just raised their hand. So back. Yeah, it didn't actually come up directly in the film. I suspect that Isaac suffers from that syndrome. That's the reason. It was never diagnosed, and that at least it was never told to me that whether there was a diagnosis of that. But I suspect that was the case, and I don't know if either of you want to comment on the prevalence or how you deal with it in the court system.
Again, I was on the original board of the Minnesota Organization for Fetal Alcohol Syndrome, which was chaired by Susan Carlson and Judge Joan Lancaster at the time, who was in the district court. And actually, I just rejoined that board now. 25 years later. And lots of good work is being done. And in fact, we did at the time institute some screening that was being done in the juvenile detention center. And we're still trying to get, how many years later, it mandated for screening for kids that are entering the child protection system. And it's a double-edged sword, because I think as a community member or as a parent, a lot of us just don't want to add another label to our kids. And yet I look at this young man that I was referring to, who's it has a warrant out now, and there is no doubt in my mind that he would meet that criteria and diagnosis, and as a result of that should be given some leeway, because when he was released from prison, you know, he first entered the child protection system when he was 2, and he had 17 placements, and he was a victim of sexual assault when he first entered. And then he went into the juvenile, he was placed in a residential treatment program when he was 9. He went through 17 placements. He's of a sibling group of 7. His mom has got some significant mental health issues, and she was a victim of severe domestic violence, lots of chemical dependency in the family. He did not know who his father was, and he learned through family members while they were intoxicated that he was the product of a rape. Oh. And that's how he found out about his father, or lack thereof. And of course, so it's no surprise that he's never really had this opportunity to live outside of a structured system. And yet he gets out of prison. He's sent to a halfway house where he's supposed to complete in 60 days. So now he's a convicted felon, has no family or support, gets sent to a halfway house. You've got 60 days to complete it, which includes finding a full-time employment and maintaining that employment, finding a place to live that is going to be okayed by probation, and then not making a single mistake in the next 2 years. Not a single mistake. It can't be done. And in fact, in talking to him when he was at the halfway house, he described to me how he felt like he was in a pressure cooker. And he said, you know, and he was starting to cry again because he said, I'm just getting so under pressure. And it reminded me of what Isaac was saying, like, what's the point? It just might as well just go back in. And we don't account for that in the criminal justice system at all. Mm-hmm. And that has to change.
I think the system itself creates that when we send people to prison. Granted, there are things where they need to be locked up, but when I worked with prison reentry, people coming home, when they came back, they not only had to deal with their maybe they were drinking when they created a crime. Well, when they come out, they have that addiction that hasn't necessarily been addressed, but they also come out with depression, anxiety, the general public thinking everybody knows what I did. So it's not just fetal alcohol syndrome, I believe we can work with, but it has to be repetitive with them. It's kind of like autism to me. And I say that because I excuse me? Yeah, right. Yeah, and so that's why I think that because it's so similar that we can work in those ways if we understand what that's about. Thank you.
Thank you. There was a question back here. You're talking about the Indian Child Welfare Act and that is threatened now. I'm sure they know much more.
No, I mean, the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978, and it was a federal law that was put in place to try to look at the issues with a number of Indian kids that were being removed from the reservation, because at that time it was 20-1 from any other child. And when you look at our culture, a lot of that is passed down through family and tradition and through oral. We learned it all from our relatives. And when you take that away and you move somebody off of the reservation and take away their identity, that adds another issue, which compounds everything. And so in the 1970s, the tribal leaders were called to Washington and put together this practice and policies and procedures. And even though it was passed in 1978, like many of our laws, there wasn't any There wasn't any monetary values put in it. So you look at tribes across the country, and when I would go out to, for example, Pine Ridge, they had their prosecutor had 1,300 cases. You know, they had one representative who's supposed to be working with all 52 states for their kids, any Pine Ridge kid across in anywhere in the country. And so there's just no resources put with that. But it is to keep kids within the family, which is best practice for everybody, not just necessarily Native kids. And it's not in my mind and not in my opinion that hard to follow when you want to follow the law. But it requires people actually getting in there and figuring out what it is, understanding why it is, and the spirit of it, and wanting to have this collaboration and cooperation. A lot of times I hear people saying, oh, it's an Indian case or an Iqua case. I don't want anything to do with that. And there's a fear that goes with that, and I don't quite understand that. I don't know if it's people are afraid they're going to do something wrong or just they don't have that desire, because it does require, in my opinion, a lot of trust relationships, good communication that only happens after you've built those relationships. And that takes time. But when you do that, you have much stronger outcomes for children. And so in Texas, in that case, I think it's just a huge disservice and really not even a basic understanding of what the law is.
Yeah, I
not that I have an opinion. Something like that.
You know, that very short scene in state court in Drew's case, you know, the judge seems to be really annoyed that he has to deal with it. He says, I can't remember exactly the words, something like, our jurisdiction has been circumvented by the tribal court. It's kind of a loaded word, right? It's sort of resentful. And, you know, it's just sort of, I guess I look at it, some judges, not all, of course, but, you know, it's just yet another layer they have to deal with, and they don't want to deal with it.
Well, I think there's a lot of paternalism that state court knows better, and that's just not true.
Yeah.
But I think if you can get past that and actually, like I said, build the relationships, it's difficult to not like somebody that you have to work with every day and talk to every day. And I think that was one of the beauties when we did the ICWA work in Hennepin County, because we had a team. We, Hennepin County being the largest county, we actually took these cases and had a couple of judges who were dedicated to do them. We had a couple of county attorneys who were dedicated to them. Same with the public defender's office, guardian ad litem's office. And that created a team within a very large environment. And I think it's been very successful. Not perfect, but there's no reason that we shouldn't be replicating that.
Yes, back there. I think issues of sovereignty and jurisdiction are so complex, and they're way beyond me, but you were nodding your head, so would you like to respond?
No, they are complex, and people read them different. And just like you said, when we look at those ugly internal issues that come up in families, those aren't necessarily a civil matter, but more of a criminal matter. So that's how they have to be addressed. And because most tribal courts aren't criminal courts right now, we're civil courts. There's a lot of, with police department, sovereignty, things like that, we still have to have a law enforcement agreement. We can't just, okay, we're the tribe now, we're going to take over, we're sovereign, we got a police department. No, it doesn't work like that. So we have to build agreements. Does that answer your question?
I think it says that this interview was correct, that there are outside forces that necessarily for lack of resources or the unmaturing of the reservation sovereignty, bill of self-domain aren't in place yet.
I would say a couple things. One is that I think it can be in place, but when you look at just the economics of it, the state has a lot more money to enforce rights than the tribes do to enforce their rights. That's been my experience. It's not that they don't possess the rights. It's not that the tribes don't want to take advantage of that, but it's really, there isn't necessarily any funding, like I said, that goes along with that. But Minnesota, I think, has a very rich and strong tribal court system. Red Lake is one of the reservations that's a closed reservation, so that only has federal jurisdiction. And so they work with the U.S. Attorney's Office on issues of major crimes, but they handle all of their own child protection issues are all done on the reservation, as are many. And the tribal courts have really progressed over time. And in fact, in our state, we have what's called the State Tribal Court Forum, and that meets quarterly, and that is state court judges and tribal court judges that meet once up on the reservation. The next time it's hosted by a state court, and that's to sit and talk about how can we work on these issues where we have dual jurisdiction or concurrent jurisdiction, or how can we better support each other's system. So we are fortunate that we have that, and in fact there was just a rule that was passed by the Supreme Court that strengthened tribal court jurisdiction. It's called Rule 10, and that was recently done. And it had there was an attempt to do that, I think, about 12 years ago, and it didn't pass. It wasn't strengthened, but this time it was. And so that, to me, is a great note of progression.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I know funding is a real issue. You know, Abby spends half her time trying to raise money to support the programs in her court, and she's actually succeeded fairly well. It's a struggle, but they are building a jail there now so that they can deal with the criminal issues in her tribe. And anyway, I could go on, but yes.
First, let me say thank you. Actually, I was sitting back over there, and I could feel your pain as I saw you watching the film. So I want to acknowledge that. And I also felt it when Isaac heard the court say that essentially his parents had abandoned him. You could feel that. I think everyone could feel that, and it's always hard for me because it's like, is it best for the kids to be there in court? You know, it's like I always wonder what kind of a impact that has on hearing that, and yet you're right, he probably knows that. And one of the things that the young man talked to me about, because I was asking him, how could we do things differently? And he talked about the fact that he needed to be removed. It was not a good scenario, but that he worried so much about his mother and how she was doing, similar to what Isaac was thinking. And he needed that just to know that she was okay. And also that he never really had the ability to talk through his trauma. And he said, you know, when I'm sitting there doing time, 10 years, he's like, I could have had the time to do that. And it takes a special person, though. I think we can't just throw any therapist or anyone in there to address that, because there has to be a real understanding of what that walk was like for him. And he talked about that, you know, he's like, him and his cellies, he said, there's so many of us that are incarcerated who have had that childhood experience. And so you're right in so many ways. And I think it's part of the problem that I have with the way that we do things currently is it's not a very transparent system. And I really wish that we would blow the doors wide open, because I think this is an issue that we all need to own, because these kids are all of our kids, and if we don't all invest in them and we just leave it to a few, it's too much. And the system, you're right. I mean, with all the best of intentions, he got sent to 17 different homes. That's unacceptable. And I'd love to say that that's not happening anymore, but that's not true. You're right. And he talked about how he now wants to be able to talk to others who are going through that path, and hoping that he can give them some of what he has learned. And I think we need to start taking advantage of that. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I was just going to say, some of the people that I've worked with that come out of incarceration, they tell me that when they're in there, that's where the gangs originated. So that's what they're telling me is, no, the gangs started inside the prison to help protect each other. And that's how we got started. But at the same time, they have similar stories. So then they don't feel alone. and they can share. But it doesn't only have to happen there. I mean, we know those stories, so we talk to them with that understanding that, okay, we know where you've been, and that's okay. That's part of what the restorative healing process is, and that's where we need to get to. Thank you.
Sit here all evening and talk about this because it's a fascinating topic, and I'm hoping that there's a ray of hope that our system will change and take on some of the characteristics of the tribal justice system. I want to thank our panelists this evening. This has been really very interesting. And we have dessert waiting for us in the atrium. So chat some more among yourselves, enjoy some cookies and bars and a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
And thank you all for coming.